All right, so we've got another Devcast broadcasting. Dan's not our usual host. Dan Smiley's not joining us today, so it's on me to introduce things. We've got our most of our API experts on the call today. We've recently been working on an API integration involving SharePoint, and that led to a desire to talk about it a little bit in one of our dev meetings. And since that wasn't a fairly narrow topic, we decided to broaden it out a little bit to API integrations more generally. And so, Joe, you've been working on the SharePoint integration. Do you want to tell us a little bit about how that was going and
Yeah, sure.
problems you came up with?
We've been doing API integrations in general for quite a while now. So I was expected the SharePoint integration to go pretty much the same as others. I had yet to do a SharePoint integration. So the first hurdle, as always, is getting your authentication, and that was pretty straightforward. The Microsoft SharePoint stuff uses a pretty standard service account and API key. It's all pretty easy to set up. Getting the curl options configured took a little bit of back and forth, but with some good old fashioned Stack Overflow searching, I found what I needed. I got my hosts configured. Got the headers correctly configured, got the quotes in the right place, all of the things that we normally have to look out for. Once that was set up and running, everything else is super smooth. Getting the calls, the endpoints configured, I feel it was pretty easy. One of the things that I was worried about with SharePoint is the fact that it can be so manually configured for each iteration of it. So the SharePoint admin can configure those lists any way they want. They can have all sorts of custom fields, all sorts of calculations that do certain things, all sorts of filters. So getting those figured out with the admin took a little bit of back and forth. But really, though, the documentation was relatively clear. There's a couple points where you kind of have to reference, what things mean in an earlier part of the documentation, so you have to go back and forth a lot. But I feel like that's pretty common in a lot of the API integrations that I've worked on in the past, few years. The bigger companies, of course, Microsoft and what other ones? The QuickBooks API, goodness, what other ones that I worked on? The Google, all the Google APIs. They seem to have a pretty good standard in place as far as documentation, how to authenticate, where to store your values, things like that. So I feel like it was relatively standard, minus some odd header information that I had to search. So overall, pretty easy.
Are you still using Postman to test everything up front, or?
I am. I'm so used to Postman at this point. It's one of those things where, yeah, I could try out some of there's at least a half dozen different tools these days, and I'm in no need to try anything else out. I don't know if anybody has any other versions of it that they've used, but I'd like to hear some advantages if there are. I'm sure that there are, but
Anybody using anything besides Postman right now?
No, just Postman. Yeah.
yeah.
With the variability about how SharePoint can be set up by different admins for different purposes at different companies, did that require more close interaction with the client on that than normal, or?
Yeah, the guy who set up the admin with the client who set up the entire integration or the SharePoint side. Not only did he set up the filters, all the custom fields, but he also set up the security. So the request being called using a service account, that account had to have specific permissions for each area within the SharePoint lists. And then they wanted to lock down which lists could be accessed and, all sorts of that kind of stuff. So there was a lot of back and forth just to make sure I had, because there were joins in the SharePoint structure of where lists were and which files could be attached to those list items. They had to figure out the permissions a little bit more carefully.
So they had to create a service account explicitly for use for the API integration you were working on.
Correct.
But they didn't open it up wide or anything. They kept the permissions pretty tight to what you just specifically needed.
Correct. Because the long-term goal is to have this push data, push statuses and things like that to SharePoint. They wanted to make sure they didn't accidentally go to the wrong list or, not have permissions to change something that, that they didn't want.
I know they added bidirectional data flow kind of late in the game. Is that already running or?
Mm-hmm. Yep, all running. That was pretty easy. Another thing where I had to kind of search down the data that was required to push into SharePoint was in kind of a different structure of the JSON object from the original query. It's in the metadata. There's an array of metadata, and so you had to pull out data from that array to use in the posting, the post action to the endpoint.
There, it's interesting as you talk about authentication. That seems to be the biggest hurdle with any API integration. Is once you can get connected, the API requests are pretty straightforward, and if you can pass, a token through at that point. But the biggest hurdle is always like getting authentication and then getting a response for what you're looking for. Case in point would, in addition to SharePoint, is whether or not you're using username and password. And I think we ran into a couple of quirks with QuickBooks where the sandbox, they give you an API key. And with production, you need to, you actually have to use an authentication process. So if you set up your sandbox, it's super simple for testing all your API calls. But then when you go to roll it into production, you have a whole authentication process that needs to be added in before you can actually start making those API calls that you've worked hard for. So.
Oh, interesting. So you're saying that they've got a separate authentication model once you're in production?
Yep. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The sandbox version, they just give you an API, a key, and that it's able to use that key, an app key, basically. If I'm remembering correctly, I don't want to misstate this, but they are completely different. But I believe it is just an app key. And then for production, you do have to go through the authentication process and use a standard authentication protocol like OAuth.
So the user has to authenticate?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It's OAuth too. So.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, and in the sandbox version, you just get an app key, and then you can use the app key to get the token. But the other is an OAuth process. So. If you're like, it's all working in sandbox, let's roll it to production. Just, remember that there's a slight difference and you're going to have to do a little bit of extra lift for that.
And did you find that out like when you rolled it to production too?
When I started to test, with the live stuff is when I found it out. Yeah. And then, basically had to, it was like, wait a minute, why isn't it giving me responses? I can't look at their actual data. You get all the sandbox data because normally with QuickBooks, right, you're not in a client solution for all of your building and testing. And then finally you do it and you're like, then you're working with them to get access to their live database. So it's a different process. And of course, right then is where it breaks down.
Mm.
QuickBooks, of course, being a little bit different than Shopify or Graph, any sort of the SharePoint stuff.
You guys have been, I know you and Evan have been in the middle of getting those Shopify integrations done.
Yeah, and that's another interesting one. So Shopify they've switched from their REST API to a GraphQL API. And so if you're signing up new, you have to use the GraphQL integration for any of your apps. And it's just a little different. The GraphQL queries process is a little different than a standard REST API. So you reference all sorts of different items. It's a lot. It's a little more. It's just a different way of looking at it. I don't know how to say it politely, but with REST API, you would just ask for an order. It would give you everything associated with an order. And unfortunately, that could include, without dialing it down to get the specific fields that you want in that request, that could include a ridiculous amount of data. And then if you asked for, 100 records, it would give you just a very big chunk of payload to then sort through. And, there's cost on the server. Even, if you don't need that information, there's no reason to request it, but it was an all-in kind of thing unless you specifically selected the fields that you wanted it to return, which, a lot of times when you do an API integration, it's like, we want to take everything on the order because we don't want to miss anything. If something gets added that's in a weird spot associated with the order for whatever reason, you don't want to miss that. Know that it's hidden, buried down in some sub table somewhere. So with the GraphQL, you do have to know that they're there, and then you have to go and find them. And so it's just a little bit different. It's just a different way of thinking about it versus the rest. So there's a little bit more lift. You have to do more loops to get the individual pieces of data at the lower, for I'm gonna use the wrong terms, but yeah, when you're in there and you're getting different, they reference them as nodes instead of in the REST API. A lot of it is meta fields. So the meta fields, you can have all sorts of different things under meta fields, and those are sort of like a open-ended variable that can be loaded, or not variable, an open-ended sort of bucket for data to be put in different fashions. And with the GraphQL version, you have to expressly access it as a node and pull the individual ones that you need. And so they have some limits in there. But yeah, that's been a difficult one for embedded systems that somebody's already written a REST API calls for, because the response was you get this big REST response, single REST response for, like, say, an order, and it has everything in that payload. And then FileMaker can go through and it'll say, you can go through it and you can say, if this, then do this, and if this, then do this. But the GraphQL side is more of a only give you what you want node wise. So you get some explicit order information at the top level. And then if you want any individual sub level, you have to request those individual sub levels and then iterate through them independently. So it just requires a slightly different setup.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. Like, you're talking about, like, line items in an order, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Line items or variants. Variance is the key one, right? Like,
okay.
Let's say and a lot of our clients don't have variants, and that's sort of one of the cutoffs that we ran into. Is they had like an April, I think it was April 1st was the big cutoff for switching to the GraphQL version. And if you had variants in excess of 100, they would not be supported. And, like, fortunately, the clients that we use, they don't have variants like that. Variants would be like, let's say you had a style of shoes and you had it in 10 different colors and 10 different sizes. And each one of those are all under that same shoe, right? Like high top Converse. You have it in a blue, you have it in a green, you have it in a red. Every single one of those is a variant, but they're all under that main product. So if you went to do a pull for that product, with all the variants, if you pulled just the product information, all the variant information would pull up. So if you had, and it's kind of like an exponent. So you'd have, 10 different colors, 5 different sizes, so that's like 50 right there. And so as far as the actual field counts of the data that you're getting back a lot of repetitive information for all the variants that are in there, because the variants can have very slight variations on what's supposed to come back. So yeah, anyway, a little bit of a learning process, but fortunately it didn't apply to any of the clients that we do we do Shopify stuff with. But going forward, you do have to use the GraphQL. So
Okay.
It's interesting that Shopify is making that choice, switching to GraphQL. I've heard from a couple of different places that in the long run, FileMaker is going to be emphasizing the OData API, and at some point in the distant future, probably deprecating the REST API. I doubt that's going to be any time in the very near future, but something to think about if we have choices about which APIs we're implementing. And of course, we're still using Claris Connect for some integrations. Our own teamwork integration is largely Claris Connect based. I know, Russell, you've been working on some tweaks to that. How's that stuff going?
Yeah, good. Claris, they recently, with our teamwork integration, we have a couple flows that utilize the teamwork connectors and some of the Claris ones. They actually recently deprecated a couple of their connectors, the FileMaker cloud and server connectors. But luckily, they're not deprecating them to the point where they're not working. They're just not, you can't create new flows with them. But they've kind of recently favored a kind of catch-all FileMaker connector. So just kind of changing our flows slowly to use that instead. And then we have a couple other, internal flows that we use for like our internal emailing. And the goal starting those was to use, there was at one point, I think it might have just been an ETS testing, but there was a Gmail send mail connector, which we don't have access to anymore, but luckily we use Mailgun account as well. So there's a Mailgun send email. And with Connect, it's really easy to set up. You just create your webhook, and then kind of like Joe was saying, we just use Postman to test the webhook initially, and you send it your schema that you're wanting to send to your flow. Like if we trigger something from FileMaker, you just send it, like for an email, you just give it your to, your from, your subject, and your body. And then with Postman, you just kind of give it that schema, that kind of structure, so it knows exactly what to expect in your webhook call, which makes it really easy. And then FileMaker or Claris also, instead of developers having to use insert from URL to kind of manually create that whole call, they've recently added the trigger Claris Connect flow step. And so it makes it even easier to kind of access. And then you can, if you're signed in your Claris ID on both, Connect and your FileMaker app, you can easily see all the flows that are triggered or flows that are active for your projects to easily kind of just call it from there. So yeah, Connect has been a pretty fun tool to kind of slowly integrate with our apps and our solutions.
I know with some staffing changes we've had in the last 6 months, you've gotten pushed into the Connect, becoming more of our Connect expert.
A little bit. Yeah. So kind of getting used to everything again. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I'm excited about what we decided to do with doing our developer emails through Connect, and being able to eliminate a couple of cases where we had email credentials embedded in client systems unnecessarily.
Yeah, and one thing I realized, we mentioned it a couple dev meetings ago, but with the Mailgun, I was initially trying to send it to the work email, but I didn't have ever a route set up. And so I did another test with just sending an email to my personal, and it sent immediately. So I think with the Mailgun, using the Mailgun API and Connect, if you're going to be sending to your same domain that's doing the sending, I think you have to have the route set up in order to send to that same domain.
So in Mailgun,
so I'll try that next time.
You set up the route in Mailgun?
Yeah.
Settings? Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think that's just if the domain you're sending from is also the domain you're sending to, then that's where the route comes into play. But if I do a test to like a personal email, like a Gmail email with no route set up, in the flow step, then it just sends kind of immediately. There's no reputation that I have to build with the domain, which Mailgun's big on the reputation. And so you can kind of build a reputation to your domain and your IP address that you're sending from. So that's also something I'm, slowly kind of researching, is how we build up the reputation with our domain. So yeah.
I'm curious, how do you set up the authentication in Connect? Does it still use the auth model where it gives you an authentication dialog and stores those credentials, or has that changed?
So yeah, so you kind of, when you build your flow step, if you select a connector using, a product we haven't quite used yet, it'll ask you then to input your credentials for that connector app. And then once you have that kind of secured and connected, and it's been validated, then you have access to the connectors through that app inside Connect.
Okay.
So it's pretty easy. It's just write in Connect to get everything kind of configured.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Excited about the changes that Claris is making in a couple of little ways for some of the licensing, where we'll be able to use Connect as a go-to resource especially for something simple like this. It's just included with the client's overall licensing. We don't have to have a discussion with them about cost. We can just grab the tool we want to use, at least for things that Claris Connect supports. Obviously, we're going to go straight to the API for some things, or use different tools for other things. But for some things, I think Claris Connect's definitely quick and easy.
Yeah, and then you get 5 free flows if you have FM, which makes it even more of a
easy.
Yeah.
Zanon, you're working on getting an N8N server set up for us for internal use, right?
Yeah. Actually, I have it set up on our internal use and ready to start putting some flows in there.
Yeah.
And
do they call them flows? And does N8N call them flows, or do they call something else?
They call them workflow. So, and then you have nodes that you put in the workflow.
I know Zapier calls them zaps.
Everybody has their own.
Yeah, everybody has
like
their own.
AWS versus Google. The terminology is the same thing, but they have completely drastically different named.
Yeah, if you're gonna do more than one syllable, it's not worth it. Like, it's too much wording you have to say.
I like zaps. That's pretty easy to remember.
Sure. I was listening to another dev meeting, or I forget what I was listening to, but actually I think it was one of the Engage presentations. They've got the recordings for the Engage presentations all out and available now. And I was listening to one of those, and someone made a comment about N8N versus Connect that was in a slightly different context. There's reasons you would pick one versus the other, but this person's reason was strictly because they wanted the server to be on premise. They were a European entity, and they had, I don't know what their requirement was exactly, but there was a reason why they didn't want to use a software as a service solution. And the fact that they could use N8N as an on-premise solution was the driving choice for them anyway, for using N8N.
Yeah, that's a big one. Yeah, and I was just looking in there at the Shopify node that they have in N8N, and it's pretty robust. It does use the REST API, the one that the node that comes that you can build. Well, they do have a GraphQL API that you can use. It's just the node hasn't been registered with the community for the GraphQL Shopify version. But you can find community versions of it and then use those. And they did open for the community edition, which is what you would use if you're self-hosting. And if you're hosting in their cloud service, then you get all this. But the community version, in order to use different community nodes, they recently added it so you can add in community nodes in the community edition. So, which is kind of nice. So if somebody independently develops a Shopify GraphQL, you can easily add it in, which is pretty cool that it's that flexible. But you do still have a GraphQL API node that you can use that's going to follow that sort of syntax and so on and so forth. Yeah, I was looking at that. I was looking at it just now, and there's quite a few different triggers that you can do from Shopify, as well as, of course, all the standard, get information about an order, all the stuff that you would expect. But all the triggers, the different triggers that you can have it perform on, is pretty extensive. And then, of course, there's a lot of other functions. N8N, just like Zapier and others, is sort of an automation workflow process. So super handy. And credential storage is, if you're worried about credential storage on third-party systems, then hosting it yourself, you are storing your credentials internally. So there is that. One thing I did want to mention on there about API integration is we also do, web apps and stuff, API integration to connect to FileMaker solutions, right? So we're going the other direction. And some things to think about in that aspect where they use a basic authentication for FileMaker. And you can, I believe for the API, you can use other authentication processes. But if you're hosting it on your own server, you're good to go. But if you're hosting on FileMaker Cloud, that there are some things that are a little bit different that you have to do in order to authenticate and then make those API calls. And we experienced that with one client in a similar fashion. We had their solution working, everything seemed like it was going good, and then we moved it to FileMaker Cloud, and all that authentication suddenly had to be reworked in order to handle it different. So you need an outside service to manage getting the tokenization, and that required hosting that on another server so that we could fill that gap. But just something to keep in mind when you're dealing with APIs, that depending on where they're hosted can also affect how you have to authenticate. So authentication, as always, is the biggest hurdle to any of these.
I've been impressed at how fast things find their way back and forth between FileMaker and the iPaaS services, the Claris Connect, or I assume N8N or Make would be just as fast. But we're using everybody obviously knows in this group anyway, we're using a Connect flow to number our tasks in Teamwork. Teamwork doesn't have a native task numbering functionality, and it's always impressed me how well that works in a almost real time environment. The fact that you create a task in Teamwork and it has a number in less than a second usually. It's almost. In a really, really transactionally intensive environment, that might be too slow. But for most environments, being able to integrate between a FileMaker or between Teamwork and a FileMaker app, where the FileMaker app is resident on a server, in this case, in the Northwest, Teamwork, I don't know where their server is hosted, but that webhook is so fast between those two systems that we've got that task numbered in barely a second. To me, that's sort of a really good piece of information to know, because it means you can rely on that kind of integration in an environment where things have to happen pretty fast. Always impressed me.
Yeah, that is key. Yes, anytime you're using some sort of a workflow processes, if it has some sort of a idle sleep, and then you'll have to wait for it to wake up in order to respond.
Yeah. And as Zapier, that's one of Zapier's pricing tiers, is how fast the Zap responds, or at least it used to be. I haven't looked at that lately, but it's an interesting way of differentiating your pricing tiers.
Yeah, I'm excited to play with their N8N instance for some workflows
Yeah, me
and
too.
find out how, see where we can see where the limits are really, and what those might be.
Yeah, I'm very much looking forward to having that as a internally available resource on one of our servers. Looking forward to that.
Everything's insert from URL except for if you're using one of the AI integrations, you don't have to use insert from URL. They have
a separate set of commands. I guess you could say the same thing for the insert, for the call, the trigger for calling the Claris Connect flow.
Oh yeah,
that's another one that we used to have to use insert URL for that we no longer have to. But yeah, they've certainly added a bunch of commands for the AI tools, so that you don't have to make insert from URL calls to support those. I haven't, obviously we've got the new version of FileMaker coming out at some point in the future that's going to have even more of that. They showed some good, interesting stuff at Engage for that. So we'll probably, I'm sure we'll be doing one of these Devcasts on the new version of FileMaker whenever it comes out. We'll be taking a look at that
yeah,
as well.
It's interesting because you have the API calls that you're making from FileMaker, and you have to create all of that inside FileMaker. If you're using like Claris Connect or some sort of workflow management process, then generally those actually are outside of FileMaker. They're doing a similar API integration, and then they're connecting to FileMaker via API to put the data into FileMaker. And so it's kind of two different ideas. Do you want to build all your API integration from inside FileMaker using scripts, or do you want to use something like Claris Connect or N8N or Zapier to do your workflow and API integrations externally, and then connect those to FileMaker using APIs to FileMaker as well?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Claris obviously considered it important enough to AI integration important enough to want to build it directly into the product versus, but they could have instead of building it directly into the product, they could have significantly expanded Claris Connect's AI tools as well as an alternative. It's an interesting observation. They could have done it either way.
Yeah,
that's an interesting point.
And we haven't even talked about MCP.
Do you want to?
AI? No, I don't want to. We'll go off into tangent.
Yeah, we will.
But MCP, is sort of the new API for AI, right? That's what the idea is. So we'll see how that changes as the future goes on. But
yeah, if you think API integration changes quickly at all, it's no comparison whatsoever to how fast the AI world changes. I'm working on a presentation for the Full Access conference in October on doing log analysis with AI, and I'm finding myself putting into my notes for what I'm going to talk about. I'm using the phrase "as of this writing" all the time because I have no idea if it's going to still work the same in October.
Definitely, yeah.
So it's an interesting. I find it a little bit stressful from time to time how fast the AI world changes, and trying to keep up with trying to figure out how to keep up with it is task.
Definitely.
We've all seen that movie.
Yeah. AI feels different for some reason to me. I don't know why, but it just seems harder to keep up with, at least so far.
Yeah, the benefit of AI is it's also made API integrations a whole lot easier because you can ask all the questions that you would normally struggle to find on
searching through docs. Yeah,
right.
That's a fantastically valid point. Not exactly an API integration, but I've been using Cursor to write Python scripts, and I'm not a Python programmer.
Yeah. And it's also good to note too, like you can have Claude or ChatGPT, any of them, Gemini, they can build the JSON for a Postman integration for an example or whatever it is that you need, so that they can build that and you can import it into Postman. And
Mhm.
so as you're like trying to figure out, I need this endpoint, I need to do this. If they don't already have a Postman, Postman is, I think it's a workflow. I'm trying to remember what it's called in Postman, but
And collection, I call it.
collection.
Like
That's right.
template.
They don't have a Postman collection, or it's just you need a slight variation on there. You can, it's now fairly straightforward to just ask Claude or ChatGPT to build you that collection with the requirements that you need, and then just be able to import it. So it's kind of a new era, even with working with the existing tools.
Yeah. And I'm sure for most of us that it's rare that a day goes by that you're not using AI in some way. Well, if we don't have any other API stuff, this seems like a good point to close things out on this Devcast. Thanks everyone for contributing today, and we'll see you all next time. As Dan likes to say, get back to work.